Hi there, this is Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. My name is Ian Willoughby. In this episode, my guest is Petr Brod, a veteran journalist with some fascinating stories to share. Petr grew up in a German-speaking Jewish family in communist Prague, but soon learned it was wiser to converse in Czech in public. He fulfilled his ambition of becoming a journalist following a move to West Germany in his late teens, and found considerable success. After a stint at the BBC that saw him work on some of its top political shows, he joined Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which posted him to his hometown when the Velvet Revolution ushered in democracy in Czechoslovakia. Petr Brod discusses his career, but also his friend, the protest singer Karel Kryl, and what might have happened if the Sudeten Germans hadn't been expelled after the war, in this edition of Prague Talk. So I'd first like to ask you about your background. You're Jewish. I've been reading that your family were German-speaking. I presume that was quite unusual in 1950s Czechoslovakia.
That was indeed, because of the large German minority that used to be there before 1945-46. Only a minute part remained in Czechoslovakia because most of the Germans, or German-speaking population, was expelled after the Second World War in an attempt to make Czechoslovakia a single nationality country, or a purely Slavonic country with two nationalities, Czechs and Slovaks. But there were a few remainders. For example, some Sudeten Germans who were so important for the industry to keep it going that the Czechoslovak authorities did not allow them to join the big exodus in 1945-46 and kept them. And then there was an even smaller minority, namely Jews who had been German-speaking before the war and who somehow either survived the concentration camps to which they were carried by the Nazis, or came back from emigration and decided to stay in Czechoslovakia. This was the case of my father, who had spent the war years in Britain. And with my mother it was a bit more complicated because my mother came from a mixed marriage. My grandfather on the maternal side was Jewish, German-speaking, from northern Bohemia. He had converted to the Catholic faith before the First World War, and while in Austria, serving in the Austrian military, he met and married an Austrian maid from Wiener Neustadt who had a mixed background, Austrian, Sudeten German and Czech. So naturally she was German-speaking too, and they decided to live in the border area near Karlsbad in western Bohemia, where my mother grew up speaking two languages, the local Egerländerisch dialect, which I didn't quite understand, and Hochdeutsch, that is normal German, as it was spoken at home. So we had this German family background, but it was more cultural than ethnic, I would say.
But did you, for example, walk down the street together speaking German, or speak together on the tram?
What a naive illusion. No, we didn't. And in fact, in those years, it could be dangerous. And one of my early memories is riding on the Prague tram in 1954. This was related to me by my mother many years later. It was in 1954, I was 3, and I saw all these sad faces around me traveling to work under the heavy Stalinist regime early in the morning, and I wanted to cheer them up. So I thought I'd sing them a song, and my first folk songs were taught to me by my grandmother, the Austrian grandmother, and my favorite song was Hänschen klein ging allein in die weite Welt hinaus, about little Johnny going out into the wide, wide world. And I didn't even get past the first 5 notes or so when my mother slapped me in the face because she wanted to stop me. For God's sake, you can't sing German songs on a Czech tram in 1954. I was rather upset, and it turned my mind against the German language. And for a few years, I didn't want to speak German or sing German or do anything German. And later on, I had to learn it as my second tongue.
Was your family affected when the communist regime turned anti-Semitic, as seen, for example, in the Slansky trial?
It was in terms of the general atmosphere, which was very unpleasant for my father. But my father was in the fortunate position, in quotation marks, of having refused to join the Communist Party in 1948, when it was suggested to him, which immediately meant dismissal from his current job, in which he could use his legal expertise. He had been trained as a lawyer. So in 1948, after the communist takeover, he was dismissed from his job, and for the next 10 years he was a manual worker. And therefore, by an absurd twist of logic, he could not be considered a hidden enemy of the state and of the Communist Party, because he didn't hide his anti-communist feelings in 1948 by not joining the party. And therefore, he couldn't be treated as an enemy within the party, which is what happened to many people with a similar background, that is, people of Jewish origin who had emigrated during the war to the West especially, or who had fought in the Spanish Civil War and came back after the war, and were now, in the early 50s, during the Stalinist trials, considered traitors to the communist cause and were tried, and many of them were sentenced to long prison sentences. So this didn't happen to my father.
And I presume he regretted coming back here after the war, did he?
He had a mixed feeling about that. He said that in 1948, after the events that I just described, after his dismissal from his job, he thought of emigrating, and at the time it was easy to cross the border because it wasn't so fortified as it was starting in 1950, 1951. So he considered it, but then he said to me many years later that he couldn't face a second emigration within 10 years, because the first one had happened in 1939 when he fled before the Nazis. And he just thought that starting again after such a short time, and with his profession, he would find it very difficult to establish himself in the West. And he loved Prague. He was a local patriot, so he thought that things would not be that bad back in 1948. It only gradually grew on him that the system, the regime, would become very bad, very cruel. But by then the border was completely closed and he couldn't back out and go abroad again.
But in 1969, your family did emigrate after you completed school. You moved to Munich. What did you find when you arrived in Munich? I guess there were a lot of Sudeten Germans from former Czechoslovakia living in Bavaria at that time.
I had no problem with that. Neither did my parents, because they had family there, they had friends there, and they were politically liberal. My father had voted Social Democrat, and he found Sudeten German Social Democrats in Munich, for example, with whom he had good conversations, and he attended their meetings and so on. And I inherited that attitude. I also became close with several of the old Sudeten German Social Democrats and with their descendants and so on. So we had our own Sudeten German milieu, and we kept a certain distance to the more conservative part of the expellee organizations, in which many former Nazis were also active. We were aware of that situation and made our own arrangements.
But you were able to return to Czechoslovakia for many years because your family had left legally.
That's right. We left with emigration passports in 1969. And up until the 1980s, I was able to return with my West German passport as a West German student, always having to apply to the Czechoslovak representation offices in West Germany for visas, travel visas. It became impossible in the 1980s when I joined the BBC in London, and it was clear that I would be in danger coming as a Western journalist, maybe hiding that fact from the authorities and so on. So there was a hiatus of about 8 or 9 years when I couldn't enter Czechoslovakia.
Well, you became a journalist after studying in Germany and also at the LSE in London and Harvard on scholarships. What was the draw of the profession for you?
Oh, it was partly because with my experience in communist Czechoslovakia, I was very curious about the world. Remember, in the 1950s and 60s, it was very difficult to travel abroad, especially to the West. It was very difficult to obtain printed matter from the West. We were in conflict with the system all the time. And I wanted to live in a world in which I would be free to say what I wanted, read what I wanted. And because I was very interested in politics, but was not interested in entering it, I thought that journalism was the best thing to achieve, to study, to work in. And I did all that was in my power to achieve that goal. And I did finally.
And what was the actual experience like of working at the Czechoslovak section at the BBC World Service?
It was great in many ways, but I stress that it was great in many ways because I wasn't sort of limited to being with the Czechoslovak service all the time. The BBC has a wonderful internal system. You are allowed to join another department for 6 months, sometimes for a year, sometimes for 3 months, after a competition. And if you're transferred there, you are able to gain knowledge and experience in a different field of journalism, which then enables you to apply for permanent jobs in that other field. So I tried my luck with the German service of the BBC because I was bilingual. But I also went to the domestic services, working at Radio 3, Radio 4. They have a joint department called Talks and Documentaries, in journalistic parlance, Talks and Docs. So I worked there twice, and I also worked on the main late-night news show on BBC television called Newsnight. So I had a lot of experience. My stay at Newsnight helped me to make it clear to myself that I wasn't born to work in television because there was too much technology involved, and I was rather more interested in formulating ideas, in writing, and in speaking on at the microphone. But working in the domestic services of the BBC was great fun, and it enabled me to travel a lot because I worked on a program which was part of the current affairs output. I did a program, for example, on the first reactions of America towards the Gorbachev regime. I did a program on Indonesia and so on. I was the producer. I was behind the scenes, so to speak. I was not speaking to the microphone. We had presenters for that. But I and the presenter would usually travel to Indonesia or to the United States or elsewhere, and it was great fun, I thought.
After the BBC, you worked in Munich, back in Munich for Radio Free Europe. How did RFE compare to the BBC in terms of approach or in terms of the mission?
They were very different. We were two broadcasters, in fact, Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe, under one roof. Radio Liberty broadcast the countries of what is now the former Soviet Union, and the Radio Free Europe broadcast the countries of Eastern Europe under Soviet domination, including the Baltic republics, which were then still part of the Soviet Union, but the United States did not acknowledge their inclusion into the Soviet Union. And our approach was quite different in terms of specific criticism of the communist regime. The BBC was rather cautious in its approach to the communist regimes in Eastern Europe. Radio Free Europe was much sharper in its criticism of the Soviet regime and in the smaller communist countries, partly because it could claim that it was not an arm of the US government.
And do you feel that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in some way contributed to the end of communism in Czechoslovakia and this region?
I don't have to quote myself. I always quote somebody else in that respect. In the case of Czechoslovakia, I quote Vasil Bilak, who was at the time, in what we call the normalization years, between 1969 and 1989, the chief ideologist of the communist regime in Czechoslovakia and one of the most Stalinist leaders of the country. And he was asked after the Velvet Revolution, how he had learned the news of the revolution in Prague and in Bratislava in the autumn of 1989. And he said, why, of course, I was listening to Radio Free Europe.
Did you know or work with Karel Kryl?
Yes, he was my colleague at Radio Free Europe, but we had met as students at the Munich University, and we in fact lived close to each other in the Olympic Village for about 3 years, because the Olympic Village, after the Olympic Games of 1972, had been turned into student dwellings, and we were both living there for 3 years. So we were quite close, and I was a sort of sounding board for some of his songs and poems, because he was a man who needed reaction, direct reaction from his listeners and friends and so on. And because I was very close to him in terms of physical distance, we lived about 200 meters apart, I would often be involved and invited to his bungalow, one of the former sportsmen's dwellings in the Olympic Village, and he would either read or recite his poetry to me or sing his songs to me.
Amazing. Radio Free Europe sent you to Prague as a correspondent when the revolution happened. That must have been complete excitement.
It was indeed. And there was an element of revenge in it, in that I could take a little bit of revenge on the communist regime by attending the first Congress of the Communist Party after its downfall from power, which was in December 1989. And I could see all these communist functionaries confessing sins, so to speak, and saying that everything they had been doing for the past 20 years was wrong, because it was not in line with the national interests of the people and so on, and from now on they would behave. So it was wonderful to watch all this from close by. On the other hand, it was also an overwhelming experience to be able to walk the streets of Prague again, to be in a free country. Remember, I was absent. I had been absent for 10 years. I was now seeing again my school friends, my other friends. I was speaking Czech as a normal language of communication, and so on and so on. It was very exciting, and my first assignment in Prague was to go to a press conference announcing the coming of the Rolling Stones to Prague.
Another amazing story. I understand that Václav Havel asked you to be the head of his international department at the Office of the President, but you weren't interested.
I was interested, but I felt I wasn't the right person for it, because journalism was my passion, and I knew inside somehow, or I had an intuition, that once I joined the political establishment, it would be difficult for me to return to journalism. And I knew that Havel's days would one day be over. That was one thing. The other thing was that I knew that serving Havel would mean an almost 24-hour day. And I wanted to have a family. I wanted to get married, which happened indeed after I found a woman in Prague who wanted to marry me. So all these considerations made me say no to Václav Havel, reluctantly, but I always tried to give it a positive notion. So I suggested people who would do the job better than me, and in both cases, when he offered me the job, he took advice from me and appointed the people that I had suggested.
Later, you were the head of the Czech service of the BBC here in Prague. I know a few journalists who went through the BBC, and I have a strong feeling that it was a kind of finishing school or a school of excellence for Czech journalism. Would you agree? Because some of those people were so good.
I would agree, although it sounds like boasting. I mean, we tried to be that finishing school. Mostly those people came to us after a few years in Czech media, and we tried to give them a new view of journalism, somewhat different from the local media. We wanted to stress the importance of international affairs so that they would not say, oh, we're not interested in Zimbabwe, and who's interested in what goes on in the Pacific or in China and so on. We based our broadcasts on both elements, local news and international affairs. We tried to give them the feeling that they are an impartial organization, that they should not side with anybody despite private sympathies for certain parties and so on, and despite the clear notion that we all were in a conflict with the communists even then, and the Communist Party was still a fairly significant portion of the political spectrum here at the time. But we told them we must speak to the communists as well, because they're part of the political setup, they're part of parliament, and so on and so on. So we tried to bring the impartial ethos of the BBC over to what had been highly politicized environment, naturally so, because it was only a few years after the downfall of communism. And I think that we did well in this respect, and I'm always very glad to see the faces of my former colleagues from the Czech service of the BBC on the television screen, or hearing them on Czech radio, on Czech public radio mostly. If they went somewhere, they usually went to the public radio and television stations when they left the BBC.
I presume you welcomed the efforts to improve Czech-German relations that began in the 1990s?
Very much so, yes. And I was aware of the historical problems, and of course the history of Czech-German relations was very close to my heart, because my parents had suffered under the Nazi regime, because we were critical of the GDR and its regime. We were also to some extent critical of what had happened in West Germany after the war, with the readmission of certain former members of the Nazi Party into the political establishment and so on. So it was a complicated set of feelings that my parents and I had towards Germany and things German and the Czech-German relationship. But I knew that Germany in many ways would now become our most important neighbor in a unifying Europe, and possibly a unified Europe, which indeed came about when we joined the European Union in 2004. And it was important for me to support the positive developments in the Czech-German relationship, and therefore I became also active in certain organizations which dealt with the relationship, especially the Czech-German Future Fund, which tries to support everything that enables Czechs and Germans to come closer, to perform joint projects, improving the environment in the border areas of the Federal Republic and the Czech Republic, or restoring German cemeteries on Czech territory, supporting school exchanges, supporting projects in cultural exchanges, and so on and so on.
Have you ever thought about what Czechia would look like today if the Germans hadn't been expelled in 1945?
It's very difficult to imagine. One wants to think that it might have become another Switzerland, where four ethnicities, ethnic units live next to each other and have been living in more or less peaceful relations for the past 700 years. But I'm afraid it wouldn't have worked that way. And especially with the communist regime here, the relationship would probably continue to be very tense, because the remaining Germans would have thought that the heavy burden of communism was brought upon them by the Czechs, because the Czechs, out of fear of German reprisals, were actually in many millions voting for the Communist Party after the war. The Communist Party, which followed the program of the expulsion of Germans from Czechoslovakia at the time. So I think that if the Communist Party had not pursued that policy and allowed 3.5 million Germans to remain within the borders of post-war Czechoslovakia, there would be an enormous amount of tension, which would have continued the tensions exacerbated by the Nazis for the next 3 or 4 decades, and that would have been terrible.
One friend of mine, actually from Ireland like myself, he has the opinion that the Sudeten Germans were ultimately fortunate that they were forced out of the country because many of them ended up in Bavaria, which is relatively wealthy, and they lived quite okay lives, and they weren't under communism.
Well, this is what I implied by what I was saying, that in a way the Sudeten Germans should be grateful for the historic fate that befell them, although they were, of course, denied their homeland, and they sat by the rivers of Isar in Munich and moaned about the loss of their original homeland, like the Jews once did by the waters of Babylon. But in fact, as far as individual fate is concerned, they had a much better time in the West than they would have had in Czechoslovakia. And a witness to that is the fact that when in the 1960s the Czechoslovak authorities allowed some of the remaining Germans from Czechoslovakia to emigrate to West Germany, the majority of them did so and went there.
My final question is a big one, but I'm very curious. You and your family have lived through a lot and seen a lot. How do you view the direction that the world is taking today when you have Trump, you have Musk, you have populism, you have Putin, you have Orban, and so on?
My only hope is that it's all temporary, and that many of the regimes that will be established by even free vote in Hungary, in Slovakia, in the United States, and elsewhere will show that they cannot fulfill the promises they give to their voters, will show that bringing more tension into international relations works against the interest of their nations, will see that with environmental change and global climate change becoming stronger, their policies of abolishing everything that tries to stop such developments were wrong, and that mankind will learn something from its mistakes. But I am not too optimistic.
Well, that sounds pretty optimistic, what you just said. It sounds optimistic to me because I think things look much worse than how you're describing them.
Hope lasts eternal.
Many thanks indeed to Petr Brod, who spoke to me for this edition of Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. I spoke to Petr at our studios in Vinohrady at the very end of January 2025. If you're new to the pod and enjoyed our conversation, why not check out some of the scores of earlier episodes and subscribe wherever you get podcasts. But for now, that's all from me, Ian Willoughby. Thank you so much indeed for listening to Prague Talk, and talk to you again very soon.